They believed they were untouchable, but the woman they detained held the power to transform their lives forever. The faint purr of Valerie's high-end sedan blended seamlessly with the tranquil atmosphere of the evening as she navigated the serene streets of Anaheim Hills. The suburban calm seemed almost deceitful, a facade that masked the chaos simmering beneath the surface. Valerie Chambers, a distinguished judge with over 20 years of courtroom experience, drove home as she often did, replaying the events of her day in meticulous detail. Earlier, she had presided over a high-stakes trial, one that required every ounce of her focus and judicial acumen. Her mind was a whirlwind of legal arguments and deliberations, yet, amidst her thoughts, personal matters crept in. Her daughter's fast-approaching graduation, the heartfelt speech she had yet to draft, and her own solemn vow to take a long-overdue break once her current case reached its conclusion. Life was busy, challenging even, but fulfilling. Then, the unexpected. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, abruptly shattering her moment of quiet reflection. Valerie's brow furrowed as she eased her vehicle to the curb. She wasn't speeding, nor had she violated any traffic laws. Reaching for her handbag, she retrieved her driver's license and registration, neatly prepared as always. The rhythmic flicker of the patrol car's lights illuminated her dashboard, creating a dissonant contrast to the calm moments earlier. Two officers approached her car with measured steps, their posture exuding authority. The taller of the two knocked on her window with an almost theatrical aggression. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration," he barked, his tone devoid of warmth or professionalism. Valerie handed over her documents without hesitation. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" she inquired, her voice steady but curious. The second officer, stockier and more menacing, leaned closer, his flashlight probing the car's interior. "We ask the questions," he muttered dismissively. Her instincts, honed by decades in the legal field, advised her to remain composed. Escalating the tension would only exacerbate the situation. "Of course, officers," she replied, her tone measured and calm, though the atmosphere was palpably hostile. What followed unfolded like a cliché from a poorly written crime drama. Innocuous questions morphed into baseless accusations, which quickly escalated into barely veiled threats. Valerie attempted to assert her position, explaining her profession and her reasons for being on the road at such a late hour, but her words fell on deaf ears. To the officers, she was just another individual to dominate, another target for their overreach. Despite the overt hostility, Valerie maintained her composure, though a gnawing sense of unease began to settle in. The taller officer, his name tag identifying him as Reynolds, stepped back and thumbed through her documents with an exaggerated slowness that felt less procedural and more performative. Meanwhile, his partner, Daniels, kept his flashlight trained on Valerie's face, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here this late?" Daniels questioned, his voice tinged with thinly veiled condescension. Valerie drew a steadying breath. "I'm heading home after a long day at work," she replied. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "Late night, huh? What kind of work keeps you out this late?" "I'm a judge," she stated plainly, her tone factual rather than defensive. She met Reynolds's gaze head-on, hoping the truth might temper the situation. Instead, her words were met with laughter, a low chuckle from Daniels that reeked of disbelief. "A judge?" Daniels repeated, shaking his head. "That's a new one." Valerie's stomach churned, but her face betrayed nothing. She had witnessed this kind of treatment before, not directed at her, but at others. The disdain, the condescension, the implicit challenge to prove her worth. It was all too familiar. Reynolds leaned closer, his smirk deepening. "Got any proof of that, Judge? Or should we skip the formalities and go straight to the part where you tell us what you're really up to?" Valerie remained calm, though her patience was wearing thin. "Officers," she began, her voice unwavering, "I've provided my license and registration. I've complied with your instructions. If there's an issue, I'd like to address it." Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her documents to Daniels and motioned toward the back of the car. "Step out of the vehicle for a moment," he ordered. A wave of disbelief washed over Valerie. She knew her rights, understood the line between lawful procedure and blatant overreach. Refusing was an option, but the risk of escalation loomed large. With a composed sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt and exited the car, the cool night air enveloping her as Daniels stepped closer, one hand resting on the holster of his weapon. "Turn around," he instructed curtly. "Excuse me?" Valerie asked, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Am I being detained?" she pressed, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Reynolds shrugged, his smirk now a full grin. "Suspicious behavior. We'll sort it out at the station." The cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists was a visceral reminder of her helplessness. Humiliation surged through her, raw and unrelenting. She wanted to protest, to shout her credentials, to remind them of who she was, but she knew they wouldn't care. To them, she was just another person to subdue. As she was led to the patrol car, she noticed neighbors emerging from their homes. An older man in a bathrobe locked eyes with her, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. Valerie held her head high, even as she was guided into the back seat. The drive to the station was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Staring out the window, Valerie's thoughts raced. Her daughter, her colleagues, the many individuals who looked to her as a symbol of justice. Would they see this? Would they understand? But amidst the storm of emotions, one thought burned brightest. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. Who could truly understand what it was like to sit where she now sat? The holding cell was stark, its walls seemingly designed to siphon warmth from both body and spirit. Valerie sat on a cold metal bench, her hands still shackled, the cuffs digging into her wrists with an unrelenting bite. She kept her posture straight and her gaze focused, refusing to let the officers see even a hint of her discomfort. They had stripped her of everything, her phone, her purse, even her watch, and left her alone in the sterile silence, as if hoping to chip away at her resolve. Time dragged, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Valerie's mind, however, refused to remain idle. Questions raced, fears loomed, and yet, beneath it all, a determination burned steadily. She wasn't the first black woman to endure such treatment, but she was determined to ensure she'd be among the last. In her mind, she meticulously catalogued every detail of the encounter, every word exchanged, every glance, every action. These memories would be vital later. Of that, she was certain. Beyond the bars, she could hear the officers' laughter echoing down the dimly lit corridor, their voices carrying a smugness that stoked her anger. "She really thinks she's somebody," Daniels scoffed, his words laced with mockery. Reynolds chimed in, but his words were lost to Valerie, though the derisive laughter that followed made the sentiment clear. Closing her eyes, Valerie drew on the reservoir of patience and resilience she had cultivated through decades on the bench. She needed that strength now more than ever. The sudden slam of a door broke her train of thought, followed by the commanding voice of someone who meant business. "What's going on here?" the voice demanded, sharp and cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. Valerie turned her head slightly, catching sight of a man in a tailored suit storming into the room. District Attorney Michael Harrington, her colleague and a staunch defender of justice, had arrived. Normally composed and measured, his expression now radiated controlled fury. "Judge Chambers?" he called out, his eyes locking on her through the bars. What in the world is this? The confidence Reynolds and Daniels had displayed earlier evaporated almost instantly. Their postures stiffened, their smug expressions replaced by a mix of confusion and nervousness. It's just routine," Reynolds began, his voice faltering under Harrington's penetrating gaze. "Routine?" Harrington interrupted, his tone as sharp as a blade. "You arrested a sitting judge? On what grounds?" The room plunged into an uneasy silence. Valerie remained seated, her face a mask of calm, though her emotions roiled beneath the surface. She wanted to speak, but she knew better. Harrington could handle this. Daniels stammered. She was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Harrington echoed, his disbelief evident. "Do you even realize what you've done? Or are you so blinded by your assumptions that you can't see the mess you've created?" Reynolds stepped forward, his attempt at salvaging the situation painfully transparent. "We were just doing our job, sir." "Your job?" Harrington shot back, his voice rising. "Your job is to enforce the law, not trample on it." From her place in the cell, Valerie observed the dynamic shift in the room. Harrington's presence had upended the officer's sense of control, and for the first time that night, a glimmer of hope broke through the tension. Justice, it seemed, still had a voice. After a heated exchange that felt like an eternity, the officers reluctantly unlocked the cell. As the door creaked open, Valerie rose to her feet, her posture as composed and dignified as ever. She met Harrington's gaze, offering a subtle nod of gratitude before turning her attention to the officers. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice calm but laced with authority, "I trust we'll be seeing each other again soon." Her words hung in the air like a warning, their weight undeniable. With her head held high, Valerie stepped out of the station, the cool night air washing over her like a balm. The humiliation of the night clung to her, but so did her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about every individual who had been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated, and she had no intention of letting it go. Beside her, Harrington walked in step, his presence a reassuring reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. As they moved away from the station, Valerie allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile.
"The officers didn't realize it yet, but their actions had ignited what they could have imagined. The real battle, however, was just beginning." The courtroom buzzed with subdued chatter as the officers entered.
Their confidence seemed fully restored, bolstered by the assumption that they would face nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Reynolds and Daniels walked side by side, their postures upright, their faces set in smug expressions. They exchanged brief glances, clearly unbothered by the impending proceedings. After all, they had their story straight. She was just another suspicious driver, nothing more. The courtroom itself was modest, but dignified, with polished wooden paneling and rows of seats now filling with spectators. To the officers, it was simply another venue where their authority would likely go unchallenged. But, as they approached the front of the room, a ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, a shift in energy that neither Reynolds nor Daniels could ignore. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. The officers stood respectfully, their hands clasped in front of them. They waited, oblivious to the growing tension in the room, until the doors to the judges' chambers opened. Then, as Judge Valerie Chambers stepped inside, her black robe billowing with quiet authority, their smug expressions melted into shock. Reynolds froze, his jaw tightening as his face turned pale. Daniels blinked repeatedly, struggling to reconcile the woman they had demeaned just days earlier with the commanding figure now presiding over their hearing. Neither spoke as Valerie ascended to her seat on the bench, her movements deliberate and composed. "Good morning," Valerie began, her voice steady and authoritative. "This court is now in session. We are here to address allegations of misconduct by Officers Reynolds and Daniels. Let us proceed." The air in the room was electric, the tension almost tangible. Valerie's calm demeanor belied the storm of emotions simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Today was about far more than personal vindication. It was about ensuring justice prevailed. Linda Avery, the sharp-eyed prosecutor assigned to the case, rose to present her opening statement. The prosecutor, Linda Avery, laid out the case with unflinching precision, meticulously recounting the officer's misconduct, from the unwarranted stop to the baseless arrest. Her voice carried the weight of evidence as body cam footage and witness testimonies painted a damning picture. On the screen, the video revealed the officers' dismissive attitudes and unnecessary escalation of the situation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom when the footage captured Valerie calmly identifying herself as a judge, only to be met with indifference. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence crumbling under the scrutiny. Daniels avoided eye contact entirely, his hands gripping the edges of the table as though bracing himself against an invisible tide. When it was Valerie's turn to speak, she removed her glasses, leaned slightly forward, and addressed the room with a steady, deliberate voice. "Officers Reynolds and Daniels," she began, her tone balanced yet firm, "this case is not about me as an individual. It is about the trust our society places in its law enforcement, a trust that you, through your actions, have betrayed." Her words were like precise instruments cutting through the tension in the room. She wasn't pleading or accusing. She was making a case, as she had done countless times from the bench. "Your actions that night," she continued, "were not just an affront to me. They were an affront to every citizen who looks to law enforcement for fairness and respect." The officers squirmed under her gaze, their discomfort growing as Valerie's composed but piercing words filled the room. She exuded a quiet authority that demanded attention, every sentence underscoring the gravity of their misconduct. The defense attorney attempted to justify the officers' actions, citing precautionary measures and vague fears of potential threats. But Valerie wasn't swayed. "Caution," she countered, her voice unwavering, "does not justify prejudice. Fear does not excuse misconduct, and assumptions based on appearance have no place in the fair and impartial application of the law." By the end of the hearing, the officers' arrogance had all but evaporated. They sat with slumped shoulders and pale faces, their earlier bravado completely extinguished. As Valerie prepared to deliver her ruling, she didn't lash out or humiliate them. Instead, she offered a thoughtful yet firm judgment, one that held them accountable while also addressing the systemic issues underlying their behavior. "In my courtroom," Valerie declared in her closing remarks, "justice is not a privilege for the few, it is a right owed to all. And as a steward of that justice, it is my duty to uphold it without bias and without exception." Her words hung in the air, eliciting murmurs of agreement and solemn nods from the audience. Even those who might have questioned her intentions earlier could now see that this case wasn't about personal revenge. It was about fairness, accountability, and the hope of inspiring real change. As the courtroom emptied, murmurs of reflection and disbelief echoed through the space. Valerie remained seated at the bench for a moment longer, watching Reynolds and Daniels shuffle out, their once commanding presence reduced to silence. She felt no triumph in their discomfort, only a tempered hope that this moment might spark their growth. Later, as she returned to her chambers, Linda Avery approached her. "You handled that with remarkable grace," Linda said, her admiration evident. Valerie offered a small, tired smile. "It wasn't about grace," she replied. "It was about doing what was necessary." That evening, at her kitchen table, Valerie sipped tea as her daughter Elena entered, still wearing her college hoodie. "I saw the news," Elena said, setting her phone down. "You were incredible today." Valerie chuckled softly, shaking her head. "It's not about being incredible. It's about doing what's right." Elena sat across from her, a thoughtful expression on her face. "But not everyone would have handled it the way you did. A lot of people would have been angry, and rightfully so." "I was angry," Valerie admitted, "but anger alone doesn't change anything. It's what you do with that anger that matters. I needed to show them, not just the officers but everyone, that justice isn't about revenge. It's about accountability and fairness." Elena nodded, her face softening. "Do you think they'll learn from this?" "I hope so," Valerie said. "But whether they do or not, I have to keep trying. We all do." The following day, Valerie received an unexpected call from a community leader in Anaheim Hills. They invited her to speak at an upcoming forum on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve. At first, she hesitated, but ultimately, she agreed, knowing that real change required more than courtroom rulings. It required dialogue, education, and relentless effort. When the day of the forum arrived, Valerie stood before a packed auditorium. The room was filled with officers, community members, and local leaders, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and unease. Valerie shared her story, not as a judge, but as a person who had experienced the sting of bias. She spoke openly about the importance of empathy, understanding, and confronting uncomfortable truths. By the time she finished, the room was silent, her words lingering in the air like a challenge. A young officer approached her afterward, his expression earnest. "Your story really made me think about how I do my job," he said. "I want to do better." Valerie smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask. Just remember, every choice you make has the power to change someone's life. Use that power wisely." As she left the auditorium that evening, Valerie felt a rare sense of peace. The events of the past week had been exhausting, but they had reminded her why she had chosen this path. Justice wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was worth fighting for. Because, in the end, justice is more than a system. It's a promise we make to each other, and it's up to all of us to keep that promise alive. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Let's continue the conversation and work toward a world where justice truly is for everyone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that challenge and inspire.